Cik i. 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 Cik i.
The growth of modern life presents problems that are increasingly complex and global in nature. To maintain our civilized society, the law system consisting of norms and penalties is needed more than ever. The Faculty of Law, one of 14 faculties at the University of Indonesia, is determined to shape competent law experts to meet the needs and to answer various legal challenges in modern Indonesia. Historically, the existence of Law Faculty of Indonesia University was preluded in 1909 by Opleiding School for Inlandse Rechtskundingen or OSVIR, which later changed its name to Red School or Law School in 1920. Then on 28 October 1924, the Dutch colonial established Rechtshoge School or Law College. This date was then commemorated as the Faculty of Law University of Indonesia's anniversary. As the oldest law faculty in Indonesia, the Faculty of Law University of Indonesia embraces technology, culture, character, and morals of the Indonesian people and aims at becoming a leading law school with high competitiveness in Southeast Asia. Based on the data from Simmons or QS World University, FHUI was ranked 101 to 150 in the world in the category of law and legal studies. FHUI's ranking in 2022 has increased from 2021, which was 151 to 200 in the world. Meanwhile, in 2022, the University of Indonesia won the first place for higher education in Indonesia based on the Webometrics ranking of world universities, the World University Ranking, and Schimego Institutions Rankings. The Law Faculty of Indonesia University offers 4 academic programs: Undergraduate, Master of Laws, Notary, and Doctor of Laws program. In collaboration with leading universities abroad, the Faculty of Law University of Indonesia offers a double degree program where graduates will get 2 degrees from 2 universities at the same period. The foreign partners of the Faculty of Law University of Indonesia include the Faculty of Law University of Indonesia provides adequate facilities and competent teaching staff to meet the international standard of education process and create good learning enthusiasm. The campus presents green atmosphere, where only 25% of the 320 hectares of area is used for academic activities. The rest provides students with urban forests, lakes, parks, and beautiful tracks. As a learning institution, the Faculty of Law University of Indonesia always encourages students to achieve excellence both nationally and internationally. The Faculty of Law University of Indonesia has provided this nation with prominent law figures and created alumni who contribute in many fields.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Honorable Professor Hikmahanto Juwana, SH, LLM PhD, as Rector of Universitas Jenderal Ahmad Yani or Unjani, Professor of International Law, Universitas Indonesia or UI, and also as President of ASEAN SEAL. The Honorable All Executive Council Member of ASEAN SEAL, the Honorable All Advisory Council of ASEAN SEAL, the Honorable Professor Dr. M.R. Andri Gunawan Wibisana as Vice Dean for Academic Research and Student Affairs, Faculty of Law UI, the Honorable Yuun Opusunggu PhD as Head of International Law Department, Faculty of Law UI, and also the Honorable All Vice Rector in Unjani, and the Honorable All Speakers, Professor Diretladi, Professor Muhammad Sahabuddin, Professor Mafluda Satorova, and Dr. Ari Afriansyah, and all the audience, officials, and the participants of this international seminar. Let me begin by giving you a warm welcome to the 9th Biennial Conference of the Asian Society of International Law 2023. The plenary session 2, Reconfiguring New Multilateralism Through the Asian-African Perspective, today on Wednesday, August the 9th, 2023, in Jenderal TNI Mulyono Building, Pisip, Unjani. This international seminar is brought to you by Unjani and UI, and thank you for Bank Jawa Barat who has supported this event. My name is Jusmalia Octaviani SOS-MA. I will be your presenter for today's event. Before we begin, allow me to remind you to mute your communication tools, and in an emergency situation, the evacuation route are only through stairs and emergency staircase. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we will enter the main program we are looking forward to, which is the plenary session. This session will be guided by our moderator, Dr. Ari Afriansyah. To begin with, I will read his curriculum vitae briefly. Ari Afriansyah is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. Besides teaching duties, currently he is the manager of International Cooperation, Faculty of Law, UI, the chairman of Center for Sustainable Ocean Policy, Faculty of Law, UI, the editor-in-chief of Indonesian Journal of International Law, the editor-in-chief of Indonesia Yearbook of International Law. He is also the president of Indonesian Society of International Lecture 2020 to 2024 and vice president of the Asian Society of International Law, ASEAN-SIL 2021 to 2023. His areas of work are mostly on issues on migration, refugees, and the law of the sea. Finally, he obtained his doctorate degree in law or PhD at the Faculty of Law, University of Otago, New Zealand in August 2013. To Mr. Ari Afriansyah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremony. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, a very good morning to all of us. I promise I will not sing again. I'm sorry for ruining your night for that event. This morning we will have a very serious discussion. The topic that we are going to discuss is, the title is the Reconfiguring New Multilateralism Through the Asian African Perspectives. I just remember that we are watch the ceremony that we're just having this morning, especially with the students and also the marching bands. What I pay attention to those performance was harmony. Despite that, they are consist of a different people, different instruments, but when they are working together, they create a harmony, and harmony creates peace. And when we talk about peace, I remember when we walked to the museum, one of the quotes that I've read in that museum is that our independence will not be benefiting to the country unless we have peace. And this is something that we really be in the moment of challenges, questioning what is meant by peace. Because we know that in every corner, not every corner of the world, but most of the areas, we see a number of conflicts, and it creates a domino effect to other countries, both direct and indirectly. And as we conceive ourselves in terms of the cooperation between states in 1945, we adamant to have this multilateralism. Of course, along the way until the time, there has been a number of changes from multipolar powers, unipolar powers, and now we're going back again to the multipolar powers. But then, what has been for the Asian and African countries? Are we going to become only the spectators, as always? Or are we going to say something, as Prof. Tony has mentioned last night in his very powerful speech? Then we have to deal both inside and for the outside of these Asian countries and also Africa. So I guess it would not be, I couldn't agree more that we're having this a panel this morning to discuss such things so that we can have a voice out of this conference, not only by way of press conference, not by way of a publication, but also I believe that most of us have consulted or are or is consulting our governments. So I guess this is one of the major role of being an academician, that being heard as a party that being independent and look as the truth as it is, without any interest that has been maybe biased by any significant interest. With me now, I have a very distinguished speakers, 4 distinguished speakers. One is in the UK via online. Let me read their CVs. First is Professor Diret Ladi. My apologies for my pronunciation. Okay. Prof. Tladi is a professor of international law at the Department of Public Law and a fellow at the Institute of Comparative and International Law in Africa. He holds a BLC LLB cum laude, an LLM from University of Connecticut, right? And also a PhD from Erasmus Rotterdam. His PhD thesis titled Towards a Nuanced Conceptualization of Sustainable Development in International Law, an analysis of key enviro and economic instruments that explores sustainable development in international law. Professor Tladi was admitted as an advocate of the High Court of South Africa in 2000. He began his teaching career at the University of Pretoria in 1997 and moving up to the University of South Africa in 2002, where he became an associate professor and head of department in 2004. In 2006, he joined the Department of International Relations and Cooperation as the principal state law advisor for international law. He later served as a legal advisor to the South African Permanent Mission to the United Nations from 2009 and 2013. In 2014, he returned to the University of Pretoria, where he currently teaches LLM modules in advanced international law, applied international law, and international environmental law. He also supervises LLB and LLM dissertations, as well as LLD thesis in his respective fields. And most importantly, we know that you are now running for the candidate for the ICJ judge, and we are hoping the best for that candidacy. And hopefully when you become the judge, you still remember us. Okay. Second speaker is Professor Mafluda Satorova. Professor Satorova specializes in international economic law, broadly defined with particular focus on international investment law, investor-state arbitration, and transnational law governing corporation. She joined Liverpool Law School in September 2010 after completing a PhD in law and LLM at the University of Birmingham, where she was a recipient of Chevening Scholarship and a postgraduate research award. Prof. Satorova works closely with international organizations and government agencies involved in the design and reform of international investment treaties and national investment policies. She has worked in an expert capacity with the UNCTAD Investment Division and the World Health Organization. She was a visiting fellow at the Lauterbach Center of International Law, Cambridge University, and National University of Singapore, and lectured as a visiting professor at the Federal University of Pernambuco, Brazil, and Nagoya University in Japan. Professor Satorova is a director of the Liverpool Economic Governance Unit and a convener of the Asian Society of International Law Interest Group of International Investment and Economic Law. She teaches international law, foreign investment, international energy law, world trade law, and EU law. Professor Satorova has worked in the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office as an AHRC, ESRC Knowledge Exchange Fellow, and as an international investment law expert. Professor Satorova's current research project is a corporation as a good citizen, funded by the British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship until 2022. My apologies. And the third professor is Professor Juana. Should I read your CV? No, no need? Okay, because everyone is already know him. As we know, Professor Juana is the rector of this university and also professor of law at Universitas Indonesia. He graduated from Universitas Indonesia, KU University, and University of Nottingham. He became a professor at the age of 36. It was the youngest professor of international law at that time, and also became the youngest dean in 2024. And he has published several books, articles, and also he has been a consultant for the ministers in Indonesia in various issues. Lastly, Professor Muhammad Sahabuddin. Professor Sahabuddin is a professor of international law and human rights at Birmingham Law School. He joined as a senior lecturer in 2016 and became a reader in international law and human rights. He previously taught at Keele University and held visiting professorship in Japan. He has global recognition for his research, including prestigious fellowships and authored books. Professor Sahabuddin was the founding chairperson of the Department of Law and Justice at Jahangirnagar University in Bangladesh. He served as a national consultant of the UNDP and was the research director at the Bangladesh Institute of Law and International Affairs. He completed his PhD at the SOS, University of London, receiving various scholarship and medals for academic excellence. I guess with all of those CVs, we acknowledge together that we're going to have a very tough discussion, and you will have many questions as well. As a sequence of talks, I will propose that Professor Tladi will have the first opportunity, and the floor is yours, 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. In Zulu, which is one of the 11 official languages in South Africa, the word unjani means how are you? So I say to all of you, unjani, minjani. Let me just begin by thanking the Asian Society for this invitation. It really is wonderful to be here with all of you. It was a very long journey for me, but I'm very pleased to be here with you. I was thinking last night when I arrived and I went to the dinner, and there was some musical items, and one of the songs was by Michael Jackson. And I thought if I could title my paper anything, it would be called The Man in the Mirror, which, as you might know, is also a song from Michael Jackson. And the reason is, I guess, the theme of my paper is that in thinking about reconfiguring new multilateralism, and international law from an Asian African perspective, it's also important that we look in the mirror. So I'm going to say a couple of things about how I think a new multilateralism or multilateralism might be reconfigured in the future from an Asian and African perspective. But before I do that, I thought maybe I might say something about a consternation that I think is underlying the quest for even asking the question. So why do we ask the question, how do we want to, the reconfiguration of a new multilateralism? I guess this great consternation is that international law just simply isn't fair. That international law is skewed against the South, is skewed against Asian states, is skewed against African states, is skewed against Latin American states, and it's skewed in favor of the North. It's skewed in favor of the big powers. But that's a cliche. I think we'll all agree that that's a cliche. Now you might turn around and say, yes, it's a cliche, and things become cliches because they're said often, and often things are said often because they're true. And I think very few of us would disagree with that sentiment, this consternation, that international law and multilateralism is skewed against the South. I think even those that like the status quo would accept it. I don't think that there's anyone in their right minds that would reject this proposition. The examples of how I think are many. I'm just going to give a few. The very first and most obvious one I won't describe, I'll just simply mention it. I think everybody in here knows, in fact, as soon as we say multilateralism is skewed, everybody thinks the UN Security Council, right? So there's no need to explain how the UN Security Council is skewed. I might point, though, to the International Court of Justice, which roughly follows the same sort of skewed composition, the same inequitable distribution of seats, although informal. right? And so that's one place also where multilateralism and international law as a result is skewed. By the way, I see Professor Lee's here. The International Law Commission, of which you are a member, and I was a member in the past, is slightly more equitably distributed, but it's also skewed. I mean, if you do the maths, and I've done the maths, of sort of how a proper equitable distribution of seats would look like, there's no way the seats would look the way they look. These are, of course, all structural points. These are points about institutions, but they're also substantive points. I mean, they're also substantive multilateral / legal related issues that point to skewedness. For example, if we think about the current economic imbalance between states, which is a fact, it's not a legal point, it's a fact, and it's a fact, by the way, that contributes to, exacerbates, facilitates the imbalance and inequality in international relations and international law. Without question, this economic imbalance is largely due, or at least in part due, to very serious breaches of international law in the past, right? Serious breaches that today we regard as the most serious, and we might refer to them as jus cogens. And here one can think of aggression, unlawful acquisition of territory, slavery, colonialism, genocide, crimes against humanity, racial discrimination, pillaging, self-determination. All of these are norms that in the past were breached, and these breaches resulted in, or at least contributed to, the current economic imbalances. I think these are facts. And yet, under international law, there isn't a duty to make reparations. There are discussions about duties to make reparations, but when these discussions are raised, we hear very fancy words like intertemporal law, or something like that, right? So that's I think, an example of how there are also substantive skewedness in terms of international law. What I find particularly interesting as examples about skewedness, as examples about imbalance, though, is skewedness that result not so much from law or legal principles, but skewedness, imbalance, inequity that results from privilege. So in other words, where places of privilege result in more privilege. I mean, here I'll give you an anecdote, and Tony, you've heard this anecdote before. We all know how decisions at the United Nations are made. The decisions at the United Nations are made largely on the basis of reports of the Secretary General, right? These are the bases. And the reason why that is because these reports are supposed to be objective. We're all supposed to trust them, almost treat them like gospel truth. Well, in 2011, I was invited to a dinner. This was a dinner to say farewell to a legal advisor of the UK mission in New York. And I don't know how I managed to get the invite, but the invited guests were the legal advisors of the Permanent Five, myself, and the legal advisor of the United Nations. And in the course of this conversation, I became quiet. I sometimes do that. I just suddenly become quiet. And so people can sometimes forget that I'm in the room. And in the course of the conversation, there was a discussion about how, in relation to the SG's report on piracy off the coast of Somalia, particular paragraphs which were difficult for the United States and Russia were actually negotiated. And so the legal advisor of the United Nations went from the office of the US legal advisor and say, would this be acceptable to you? No, well, it would be acceptable if you did this. And then they went to the Russian legal advisor. That's a privilege that's not open to Indonesia. It's a privilege that's not open to South Africa. It's a privilege that's not open to Singapore. It's a privilege that's not open to Malaysia. It's a privilege that results from privilege. I mean, I didn't even know at that point that people had such free access to the legal advice of the United Nations, let alone that the legal advice of the United Nations actually went to their office rather than the other way around. But here's another example of privilege, and this is one which always surprises me. I mean, it surprises me that very few people know this. You know, again, it's about the UN Legal Council, and I have nothing against that office, by the way. I think it's a very important office. This is the top lawyer of the United Nations, yes? Appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations. What is probably not very well known is that that position of legal advisor is reserved for a European. Since the UN was established in 1945, 8 people have had the privilege of calling themselves UN Legal Council, and they've all hailed from Europe. Why? Because no African, no Latin American, no Asian can be trusted with directing the international law affairs of the United Nations. Right? And needless to say, of course, this is also a result of great skewedness, a result of great, at least a contributor to great skewedness and a contributor to the inequity. Yet the point that I want to make today, though, is that as unfair and as inequitable as multilateralism is, as unfair, as inequitable as international law is, pointing to this inequity without looking in the mirror is not helpful. Pointing to this inequity without acknowledging some complicity on the part of Asian and African states, on the part of Latin American states, on the part of Asian, African, Latin American international lawyers is not helpful. When I arrived at the dinner last night, it was at the tail end of Tony's talk, which I thought was very powerful, the parts of it that I heard, but then I think every talk that Tony gives is powerful. And I thought one of the points that Tony was making was that being critical must also mean being self-critical, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what role have we played in sort of promoting this inequity? So obviously, the main question that I'm pondering is, what is it that we can do? If you think about some of the things that I started with, now of course I won't mention the composition of the Security Council, we know that that's rather difficult. But even there, by the way, I think that there are things that we can do, but I understand that that's rather difficult. But if you think about the court, right, if you think about the importance of the International Court of Justice, that composition that I described, which largely reflects the composition of the Security Council, there's no reason why it should look like that. Asia and Africa alone have 106 votes out of the 96 votes that are, out of the 193 votes, right? And you need 96 votes, which means that one cannot become a judge without a support of this, the Asian and African states, right? So there's some complicity there. Now, one might say, and how much time do I have? Okay, I've got 5 minutes, all right, I'll be quick then. So one might say, though, that if you look at the trajectory and the decisions that the courts have made over the years, these decisions, in fact, I've heard this argument that these decisions have largely not been anti-South, that these decisions have generally been pro-South. One example, for example, of this is the recent Chagos advisory opinion. I would point out that if you look very carefully and you take a very nuanced look at these decisions, one might come to a very different decision. And so I start off with the Chagos advisory opinion. There, of course, the court essentially found that the United Kingdom control of the Chagos Island was a violation of self-determination. But what the court did not find, which was critical in the broader scheme of things, was that self-determination was a norm of jus cogens, which itself would have particular consequences in that particular dispute. And why? Particularly when you think about the number of arguments that were made about this Yuskogan's status of self-determination. Another decision which I think is really, really important is a nuclear advisory opinion. Now, in the nuclear advisory opinion, the court, incredibly, by the way, decided that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of humanitarian law. However, in view of the current state of the law, the court cannot conclude definitively that such use would be lawful or unlawful in extreme circumstances. I find that incredible. But what's even more incredible, and this is important for the purposes of composition, is that if you look at the individual opinions, one will find that judges coming from nuclear weapon states essentially upheld the right to use nuclear weapons. Right? So it's important when one is thinking about all of these decisions to think about the broader arguments. I'm just going to skip over a few points here and just end by saying there are things that Asian and African states can do, low-hanging fruits that Asian and African states can do in sort of trying to reconfigure international law. And I think it's important, it's high time, that while pointing out to the inequities and the unfairness of international law, that Asian and African states are encouraged to do more. It's time to look in the mirror. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ladi. I was very provoking thoughts of the talk. I noticed a number of very important points, especially when you start with international law isn't fair. Thank you very much. Now we go to Professor Satorova. 10 to 15 minutes. Time's yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And it is a pleasure and privilege to be here today. And when thinking about my contribution to this plenary session on how we reconfigure multilateralism from Asian and African perspectives, I decided to frame my thoughts along the lines of a wish list which has been inspired by writings on Bandung, including Lewis's book, the book that he co-authored, and the plenary session that we listened to today, but also various conversations I have been part of over the last few days. Ironically, the wish list will revolve around some of the key absences in the Bandung agenda, but also one big elephant in the room. And ironically, one of those absences will almost ended up being myself, because I very nearly missed the pickup time for this morning travel here to this university. That would have been really funny if I was absent in this plenary. But that in some ways would have been emblematic, because one of the key absences that I wanted to talk about was the absence of the Soviet Union, Russia, and also Central Asia. And if I'm correct, there are only 2 Central Asians here in this audience today. And my perfectly sanitized CV that was read out earlier perhaps somewhat hid the fact that I am an Uzbekistani, and as a perfect colonial product, I ended up being a professor at the University of Liverpool, and here I am today speaking at the Asian Society of International Law Conference. So Central Asia, as part of the Soviet Union at the time, was conspicuously absent at the Bandung Conference, and that at the time reflected both the reality of the circumstances in which the conference took place, but also of its troubling legacies. What we heard a lot about already in the course of this conference, one of the most troubling events in the current affairs, and that is the ongoing invasion by Russia of Ukraine, is something that is also linked to that absence. So for a long time, the Soviet Union and then Russia has presented themselves as a victim of Western imperialism, but also a benevolent power in the East. Russia's mission in Central Asia, both during the Soviet times, before that, but also after, was to remove the native from the damnation of prehistory and deliver him to the gates of history. And Russia did deliver us to the gates, but where do we go from there? What is the role then for international law, and how would it enable the newfound independence of Central Asian states? For Central Asia, freeing itself from the colonial shackles of Russia meant embracing the language of civilization and development. And in practical terms, it meant mimicking neoliberal economic prescriptions. To quote from Tony's work, to lift ourselves from backwardness and barbarity, we were told that the only way is actually to embrace international legal prescriptions on the sanctity of property, liberalization of trade and commerce. So where does it leave Central Asia now? And I can go on about it, go on and on, but I have only 10 minutes. So what does it mean for international law, this stage at which Central Asian states, but also many others like them, find themselves? It means that when we talk decolonization, we need to remember that for many in the global south, the West is still seen as a standard bearer and Western norms and institutions as something that needs to be embraced, mimicked, heeded in the name of our own salvation. And I had a number of conversations with Central Asian scholars, and one of them actually took a part in the margins of a workshop that we organized under the aegis of the Asian Society of International Law on teaching and research and decolonization of teaching and research of international law in Central Asia. And one of my Kazakh colleagues told us at the time, he said, look, we do understand about international law and its imperial origins and its imperial present. However, to us, this is a stark choice. Where do we go from here? If we don't embrace the modern contemporary Western ideals, then we need to go back to Soviet rules. Or if we go back, then we go to that point of the gates of prehistory. So decolonial teaching and research and decolonial resistance in the way we wish it to exist haven't quite reached Central Asia, but they also, I would suspect, haven't reached many other parts of the global south. And in that sense, I remember the introductory chapter in the Bandung book where the phrase that caught my attention was that when we talk about global south or the third world, it's actually not just one single third world. There are many of them, and there are so many different third world projects and many third world futures and pasts. Another absence that I want to talk about, the Bandung absence, something that continues to haunt contemporary international law. And here I'll be speaking in my capacity as an international investment lawyer. I am not a generalist, so I don't have this admirable ability to reach out to other disciplines of law. But as far as international economic law is concerned, one of the absences that haunts contemporary international investment law is the absence of local communities. So Bandung's agenda was framed in terms of decolonization, independence, but what it did, it centered the nation state as a vehicle to deliver on these laudable objectives. Local communities have disappeared, and their needs and demands would need to be channeled through the states. And you can see it even in the key UN instruments adopted during the subsequent NEAR era, New International Economic Order era, which reflect that everything is about obligations of states, rights of sovereign states, but we do not have local communities. Local communities have been somewhat erased. And that, again, taking cue from Tony, and he had really good advice at day one of this conference. He said, just be yourself when you speak. So I'll be myself again. Another conversation I had, one of those really thought-provoking and intellectually inspiring conversations was again in Central Asia, where we were talking with the representatives of civil society organizations, forming part of this resistance to various foreign investor-led projects in the natural resources. And what caught my attention at the time during those conversations is that there was very little resistance of the kind that we've historically been accustomed to seeing, for example, in Latin America, or even some countries on the African continent, where local communities would come out and stand in opposition to the extractivist projects in the natural resources sector. And what I remember that, well, in Central Asia, due to its own experience of being colonized by Russia during Soviet days, that idea of the local community as a beneficiary of natural resources, of the wealth, does not exist. It has been completely erased. It has been completely erased because the nation state or the state-sanctioned collective replaced both the individual but also the community. And that continues to shape the conversations, that continues to shape what happens there in that space when, for instance, local communities indeed face the negative, harmful consequences of extractive projects in natural resources sector. Nothing is actually framed in terms of a local community opposition, because local community as such isn't there. Just as it happened in the international law sphere, it has been somewhat erased. And if we talk about the wish list, it would be good going forward to reinstate them, to find ways to bring back those who haven't quite made themselves visible in the language and the text of international law, international economic law instruments. And thirdly, one of the lingering or rather enduring legacies of Bandung, which hides itself deep in the layers of texts of major international legal economic instruments, is the national, and again inspired by the works of Tony, but also Professor Orford. The national, as far as international economic law concerned, is international law's other. But what it does in this particular space, in the space of international investment law, is that the national, in the post-Bandung era, became the site through which international law did much of its neo-colonial work. Globalism, as many of us here would know, did not displace nation states, but what it did, it worked with and through them to ensure the proper functioning of the forces that long underpinned the imperial extractivist project, the projects of exploitation. So national law has played really interesting contradictory parts in this project. At first, it was maligned as a savage, as a form of law that was inferior and that needed to be neutralized or disapplied. Some of you will know about arbitrations, including one of the famous or infamous one, the Abu Dhabi arbitration, when one of the arbitrators actually said that, well, the applicable law of the host state wouldn't quite be applicable because it was so primitive that it had to be disapplied. Even when the language of underdevelopment receded in the past, national law is still, it continues to be dismissed in many cases for its inability to live up to the standards required by the modern business environment. And we see examples of that, plenty of examples of this in international investment law, where the decisions of domestic courts are dismissed, or national courts, national laws themselves are seen as inadequate due to various shortcomings. And at the same time, whilst being maligned as savage, barbaric, and primitive, the national continues to exist with this understanding that modernization is actually not quite achievable. It doesn't really matter how many efforts you take to modernize your national legal material. your domestic laws will never quite reach that standard of perfection that international law expects of it. So when national laws, for example, protect the social, be it indigenous rights or some other social public policy objectives, it can be overridden, and it tends to be the case in investment arbitration jurisprudence. If it fails to protect the social, it can also be the form or the basis of liability for the state. International law still then continues to constitute itself through its favorite other. It needs the national in order to justify its existence and to manifest its superiority. And we see that a lot. We saw it at the foundational stages when, for example, international investment law and its arbitration mechanism came into being, but we continue to see it today in the conversations that are taking place in various reforming institutions, be it the ANCETRAL, UNCTAD, or others. So international investment law is there. It is a superior form of governing state-investor relations, and here, interestingly, again, as part of these reform efforts, you see how the constitutive role of the national takes another interesting dimension. So habitually dismissed and overridden, national law is seen as a vehicle for preserving values and protections enshrined in the international realm. If the international law is for some reason unavailable, then the national law can always be willed in to fill in the breach. And there was this famous case of Holiday Inn, where there was no applicable international investment agreement on which the investor could rely. So the very clever investors, lawyers, decided that, we'll use the national law of Egypt to sort of concoct this consent to arbitration. So national law can also be useful when needed. And then national is also at some point was seen, especially in the Bandung era, understandably, the national was seen as a form of liberation, as a form of decolonization. But owing to continuous efforts by international organizations, what happened is that in the large swathes of the global south, we see the diffusion of norms, which are presented as national laws, but they essentially, again, mimic international law. For example, national laws on investment protection that many countries of the global south have on their statute books accidentally or otherwise adopted the language of the oppressor. They mimic the text of bilateral investment treaties and other international instruments. So, and it is in this space, these are the three major points that I wanted to zoom in on. Two key absences and one big elephant in the room, and that is international law's other, or national law. And if we think along those lines about reconfiguring multilateralism and thinking about the legacies and inspirations drawn from the Bandung era, then it becomes imperative to remember that some of those key instruments through which we were supposed to achieve that decolonization, liberation, and so on, they can actually be co-opted in maintaining and entrenching imperial and neo-colonial practices. And also we need to remember that indeed, Third world is not just one homogeneous entity. There are many third world projects, and they will require us to rethink and revisit the language we use when we talk about decolonization of international legal scholarship, of international legal teaching, but also international legal practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Satorpa, for two lists and one a big elephant. I think, again, as a provoking thoughts for all of us. And now we go to Professor Hikmah Tujuana for your talk, 10 to 15 minutes. Please, thank you. Oh, yes, please. This is a difference because this is the president of the university.
And also president of ASEAN. All right, thank you very much, Ari. If I may have my PowerPoint. My talk will be uh, on issues of reconfiguring new multilateralism through Asian perspective. And then I will see the Ukraine war, war as a case study. Next slide. First question is, next slide. The first question is, who are we to judge? You know, when I look at the war in Ukraine, people will say, well, that's an invasion of Russia. But Russia will say, no, we are defending ourselves. We are defending the Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk from attack from the Ukrainian government. Because as you remember, prior to the attack by Russia, Russia recognized the two republics as a state. So my question is, you know, a lot of people will say, well, this is invasion. No, this is a self-defense. The question is, who are we to judge? Are we the one who are judging by saying that this is right or this is wrong, right? To me, international law, as of now, next slide please, especially in issues of armed conflict, is they use as a legitimacy. So state, when they take actions in issue of armed conflicts, they look at international law to legitimize what they are doing. They know that war should be prevented. War can only, next slide, in modern times, use of force is prohibited except for self-defense and mandated by the UN Security Council. We know from the preamble of the UN that says that to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Meaning that, you know, we need to not use the force. And if I look at the practice from state prior to 1945, there is the Secretary of War, Department of War. Nowadays, you will not have a Secretary of War or Department of War. Now you have the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense. Why? Because the only permissible use of force is under Article 51 of the UN Charter, or mandated by the UN. Now, the question is the war in Ukraine justifiable? Well, according to Russia, yes, based on Article 51, as I mentioned. But according to Ukraine, the attack by Russia, this is in contravention with Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. When I said Ukraine here, of course, those who support Ukraine's defending itself, they'll say Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. Next slide, please. Okay, the question is, can international law, as a rule, limit national interest or ego of state? Of course, they will say, this is our national interest. But the question is, how far can you stretch that this is our national interest and you try to legitimize based on this international law? Next slide. When I see the war in Ukraine, I see 4 scenarios that will end the war. The first scenario, next slide please. Well, the first scenario is either Russia or Ukraine won the war. And in order to do this, either Russia or Ukraine, they will beef up their use of force. We know Ukraine is supported by NATO. They are sending a lot of arms to Ukraine to defend against the attack from Russia. But vice versa, the same thing happens. So what I see is, in this first scenario, the war is going to escalate. And we know that. It has been escalating, the war. Next slide. The second scenario. Well, the second scenario is if you have a change in government, either in Russia or in Ukraine. Right? Now, when we say a change of government, there are two types of changing the government. One, constitutionally, based on the local constitution of that country, or second, unconstitutional. When we say unconstitutional, then there's going to be intervention made by, I don't know, invisible hands, I suppose. But that will happen, right? The scenario of a change of government is, if there is a change of government, then there's going to be a change in policy. That's what everybody is hoping. Right? The third scenario, well, the third scenario, this is very scary. A zero-sum game. Especially if Russia felt that everyone against them. Because Russia has a nuclear power, nuclear armaments. Next scenario, slide, next slide. Okay. Zero-sum game. And no one will benefit. Not Russia, not Ukraine, not Europe, not Asia, not Africa, not America. Because once the nuclear war started, then I suppose this is the end of mankind. But of course, we have the fourth scenario. The fourth scenario is a third party acting as a mediator. This third party not only mediate, but also try to save the faces of those who are engaging in the conflict, because they need to save their faces. As I see it now, the war, is a point of no return. No one will say that, okay, we'll stop and then we go back. No, they will continue unless there is a third party, and then this third party will save their faces. They are not going to lose the war, but they will end because of the third party. And I think, next slide, this is what our president is trying to do, President Joko Widodo, and of course, other presidents, for example, Erdogan. Yeah. Because we in Indonesia believe that to stop the war, we have to refer to Article 2 of Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter, which says that if there are disputes between states, then they should settle it by peaceful means, in such manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. This is written in the UN Charter. Article 2, Paragraph 3. Now, because we need to reconfigure the Bandung principles, the 10 principles. So I mentioned here the 10 principles. First of all, respect for fundamental human rights and for the purpose and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. This has to be the solution for the war in Ukraine. We need to respect the fundamental human rights, not only for the fundamental rights of the Russians, Ukrainians, but all of us in this world. And of course, we have to abide by the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Number 2, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. This is very relevant, looking at the war in Ukraine. But of course, the third principle, recognition of the equality of all races and of the equality of all nations, large and small. You know, sometimes when you engage in a war, the ego is on you. That's why when our president went to Ukraine and then went to Russia, he did not ask the two countries to stop the war. But he was telling them the consequences if the war is prolonged, the consequences to the third world countries, the issues of food crisis, financial crisis, those kind of things. He did not say, look, you have to stop the war, or let me, mediate and then we agree to stop the war. No. He was telling us that, all of us, all races, all nations, large and small, will be affected by the war in Ukraine.
Excuse me, for
Yes.
Professor, 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Okay. Okay. Abstention from intervention or interference in the internal affairs of another country. This is the scenario that I said that the change of government. We've seen this in the Arab Spring, for example. Yeah, how government is changed because there is intervention, and also respect for the right of each nation to defend itself singly or collectively, but in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. Yeah. This is the far more important issues. Abstention from the use of arrangement of collective defense to serve the particular interests of any of the big powers. And also abstention by any country from exerting pressures on other countries. So if you look at the principles, I'm not going through the 10 principles because my boss here from Universitas Indonesia, I'm from Unjani, and I'm very inferior from Universitas Indonesia, even though, all races has to be the same. In any case, if you look at the principles, the 10 principles, these are relevant in today's world. So how are we going to reconfigure this? Well, first, as I mentioned, by not judging who is right or who is wrong. But we need to have an alternative. And that alternative, hopefully, is by ending the war by peaceful means. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi.
Thank you very much, Professor Hikmanto. Despite that I'm the moderator, I always be his junior. Okay, finally, from another continent, Professor Muhammad Sahabuddin, are you connecting right now?
Yes, I am. Can you
All
hear
right.
me clear and loud?
All right, thank you very much. Can the community display Professor Sahabuddin? There you are. Okay, Professor Sahabuddin, 10 to 15 minutes, time is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am actually from the same continent. I'm from Bangladesh, but currently I'm speaking from the UK. And good morning and assalamu alaikum to everyone. Thanks very much to Asian Society of International Law for inviting me to this very important conference of Asian Society of International Law. And this year's conference is especially important due to its location in Bandung. Unfortunately, because of some personal circumstances, I could not be there with you in person. But my thanks especially to the organizing committee for taking this additional trouble on top of everything else that they have gone through in the last many months, I'm sure. to arrange this online platform and to make it possible for me to participate in some capacity. So I'm immensely grateful to all of you in the organizing committee. I had been asked to share some of my thoughts on reconfiguring new multilateralism through Asian and African perspective. So what I'm going to tell you this morning might have been already said by speakers yesterday, and I have already heard today. But the good thing is, since I'm not physically present and didn't have any chance to listen to Professor Anghi's apparently wonderful speech and all other previous speakers yesterday, I have this advantage of not knowing. So I'm going to share my ideas anyway, irrespective of whether those have been said. But these are also so important that perhaps people don't mind hearing those again and again. So I am essentially going to talk about Bandung spirit and what does it mean for our thought process when we think about multilateralism and how to reconfigure that. And I would also engage with Bandung in a way. I think one of the important themes that have emerged, as I've understood from previous speakers, kind of the need for self-reflection in a critical way. So if I start with the general premise, at the global level, such reconfiguration of multilateralism would essentially mean breaking with imperialism as embedded in current global governance structures. And as you have heard from previous speakers in this panel, it is there. So when we talk about this reconfiguration, it is given that we have to start with that. It would also mean mainstreaming core themes of Bandung conference that we have just heard regarding sovereign equality in substance, regarding mutual respect and cooperation, regarding human rights in the working of international law and institutions. Now, there is something interesting. So the US State Department has a kind of component, Office of the Historian, and they had a kind of scheme which is now defunct on historical milestones, kind of like short pieces on various historical milestones seen from US point of view. And this is what the entry on Bandung said in its conclusion. So it talked about US anxiety, hesitancy, suspicion, but this is how it concluded the entry on Bandung conference. I quote, Bandung gave a voice to emerging nations and demonstrated that they could be a force in future world politics inside or outside the Cold War framework, unquote. So if we take a cue from there and think about today's great problems, we have heard about Ukraine war, we have to engage with this question of climate justice and international trade and arbitration and all sorts of areas. The question then would be, where does this force, the third world, stand in reconfiguring new multilateralism? Of course, like as we have heard, and my friend Mabud also highlighted, that it is not one thing. Third world or the global south is far complex, but how, like if we think about this reconfiguration, where do they stand? So in the remaining time that we have, I'll talk about this reconfiguration of multilateralism by focusing on 3 different areas, and I'll try to be as specific as possible, but I'll engage through the optics of Bandung. The first point of the strand that I would like to highlight is the strand of regionalism and imperialism. Now, regionalism can play an important role in the reconfiguration of multilateralism. In the long run, such initiatives may not be just confined to the domain of economy and trade alone, but it might have to look into more widespread political aspects to materialize the full potential of regional cooperation. Now, regionalism has always been an area of uneasiness in international law. While at the doctrinal level, regionalism is an accepted norm and often works as a proxy for internationalism, liberal ideologues have had difficulties coming to terms with what they see as a fragmentation of, or at least a short-term deviation from, their universalist teleos, or the liberal end that liberal international law promises. Also, historically, regionalism often took a turn to regional sphere of influence, quote unquote, and eventually to full-scale imperialism. There are at least three interesting examples in international law. The first one, more popular one, is of course this idea of Monroe Doctrine in the Americas, and how through this doctrine, USA could assert its own imperialism in the process of counterbalancing European imperialism in those continents. The second one, of course, in the interwar period in Europe, under the Nazi doctrine of Grossraum, or grand space, and Lebensraum, a living space based on racial hierarchy and territorial premise that again talked about the dominance of Nazi Germany all over Europe, and then rest of the world divided into various grand spaces. You know these stories. And of course, finally, within, which is more relevant, I would think, in the Asian context, this idea of Pan-Asianism, which is conventionally associated with Japan's imperialism vis-a-vis other Asian neighboring countries during the Second World War. The Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which Japan propagated in 1940, epitomized the height of the country's expansionist campaign in the region. Japan also convened the Greater East Asia Conference in 1943, attended by representatives from six so-called independent Asian countries at the time, but each of those were also actually under Japanese control. Interestingly, Indonesia was not invited to attend, even though three important national leaders of Indonesia, including President Sukarno, later President Sukarno, were visited Japan at the time. It is therefore no surprise that 12 years later, in April 1955, when President Sukarno convened the Bandung Conference, he made no reference to the Great East Asia Conference of 1943, although he referred to Anti-Imperialist, Anti-Colonial League conference in Brussels in 1927. But there is another important aspect of this story of Pan-Asianism, which I think is important that we take seriously. Pan-Asianist movement in the early 20th century also had an anti-imperial dimension. As an anti-imperial ideology, Pan-Asianism put forward a normative argument for Asia's emancipation from Western imperialism and provided an alternative to the dominant Eurocentric discourse on civilization, a vision premised upon a shared Asian spirituality, heritage, culture, and glorious past. As an anti-imperial strategy also, Pan-Asianism offered Indian nationalist leaders in exile, especially in Japan and in the US, the language they needed to gain the support of the Japanese and the Chinese in favor of their nationalist movement against British rule in India. The same can be said about the anti-imperial sentiment of the Pan-Africanist movement during the interwar period. Both Pan-Asianists and Pan-Africanists submitted petitions to great powers during Paris peace negotiations, demanding an end to colonial rule under the principle of self-determination. So, when we think about reconfiguration of multilateralism in today's world and acknowledge the importance of regionalism to that project and reflect on Asian-African perspectives, the question of imperialism cannot be overlooked without being disrespectful to the lessons of history. And here comes again the centrality of the Bandung spirit. Bandung developed global principles against imperialism in all forms. The final communique termed colonialism in its all manifestations as an evil which should speedily be brought to an end. With that Holy Spirit in mind, the regional reconfiguration of multilateralism needs to be attentive to the same principles of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and mutual respect and cooperation. To make any sense to less powerful nations in Asia and Africa, such multilateralism must be egalitarian and inclusive at its heart, and so that the new forms of imperialism do not take roots in respective regions. The second strand that I would like to highlight is multilateralism beyond the state. And the importance of going beyond the state-centric approach in conceptualizing new multilateralism. As noted earlier, Bandung developed global principles against imperialism in all forms. At the same time, Bandung's nationalist agenda, expressed in the legal terms of sovereignty, had serious repercussions for subaltern groups, such as minorities and indigenous people, within post-colonial states. At Bandung, sovereignty was primarily characterized as a necessary bulwark against imperialism and a precondition for world peace among nations. Despite the anti-colonial and anti-imperial theme of the conference, many of the states who participated in Bandung and afterwards had that spirit in mind themselves adopted the national state ethos and ultimately developed a colonial relationship vis-a-vis their minorities and other marginalized groups. Professor Anghi has written about that in his chapter in the Bandung volume. Thus, Bandung's nationalist agenda highlights how sovereignty often has a close yet contradictory relationship with imperialism. Moving forward, in the project of reconfiguring new multilateralism in our time, it is imperative to take the role of civil society seriously. There are some important examples of successful multilateral collaboration between state agencies and the civil society organizations, but also civil society-led actions in advancing global justice movements in a number of areas. To give some quick examples, for example, the Loss and Damage Fund as part of the Campaign for Climate Justice is a direct outcome of such collaboration between state agencies and grassroots organizations.
I'm sorry, Professor. 3 more minutes.
Yeah.
Sorry, 3 more minutes. Yeah.
Sure. The campaign for reparations is also growing through the active support of those organizations. Decolonizing movement, especially in higher education sector, is student-led, but also strong participation is forcing former colonial powers to offer apology. Very recently, the talk about sending historical artifacts to Indonesia and Sri Lanka from the Netherlands. These are all important, not sufficient yet, but important initiatives. So I think when you talk about multilateralism, we have to look beyond this state-centric approach and think about civil society organizations and their participation more seriously. And the final point, and I promise I'll stop with that, the role of international law and legal capacity building, in other words, the legal architecture for that vision of new multilateralism. There is a general consensus on a number of issues among international lawyers in the Global South, which is kind of demonstrated by 12 scholarship in multiple generations. So one is international law is hegemonic, yes. It creates and sustains asymmetric relations of powers, yes, we agree on that. But giving up on international law completely is a luxury that the third world cannot afford. So there is a kind of general consensus on these points. There is also a consensus that there is a need for demanding reforms and fighting for it through strategic use of international law and institutions. And if one needs motivation to that fight and struggle, there are bright examples in the form of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, new international economic order, and many such examples of how third world international lawyers fought bravely on the floors of General Assembly to make that happen. Reflecting on this long tradition, there is a need for capacity building in areas such as commercial arbitration, treaty negotiations, trade negotiations, international dispute settlement, so on, so that we don't need to always rush to important and also expensive law firms in Brussels or in London and other places. And as part of this larger project of reconfiguring multilateralism, as well as its legal architecture, I think this is extremely important that we build our own capacity. Just to conclude, only a few weeks back, I had the privilege of engaging with 50 senior government officers, law officers from 43 Asian and African countries in the ALCO research and training program in Beijing. And that was a wonderful experience. As a tangible legacy of the Bandung Conference, ALCO, which is Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, can actually take a lead role on exploring how Asian and African legal perspectives can help develop necessary legal architecture and legal skills for a more humane multilateral world. And I think that is what this conference is all about. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sahabuddin. Since we have a very tight time, we still have around 15 minutes for question and answer. I think we only have one round of question and answer. Now I'm in the position of very difficult. There are many questions, so I have only choose two first, yeah, for this side and that side. So I take the privilege of gentleman in the front, yes, and one from Sergey, yes. The committee, the mic, please. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Do you hear me? Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you very much. I think I asked a question.
Sorry, can you state your name?
Yeah,
please?
my name is Serhii Masol. I'm Humboldt postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cologne, Germany. I think I must add one little detail, which I did not do yesterday at the plenary session. I'm a citizen of Ukraine, apparently the only one in this audience. I think it does matter. Apparently it does matter in terms of which kind of answers I get to my questions. And I think I got some sort of an answer to my yesterday's question today when I listened to Mavludas Satarova's talk. And I have a question or a comment to Professor Joanna's presentation, which concerned my home country. In Jakarta, a couple of days ago, I took a taxi from the airport, and the taxi driver asked me, "Where do you come from?" I said, "From Ukraine." And he said, and I quote, "People in Indonesia want peace," which goes in line with what you said in your presentation. And I will repeat now what I said, what I responded to the taxi driver in Jakarta. I said, so do people in Ukraine. And this is why Ukrainians are fighting like Indonesia did in its war of independence against the Dutch Empire. And here comes my comment about your scenarios, which you outlined quite in detail. I mean, I can talk a lot about each of them. I have my own opinions, which is more likely and which is less likely. But I think there is one thing permeating all possible scenarios, and which is at the core of the problem, which is at the core of this armed conflict. And that is Russian imperialism and the imperial mindset of ordinary Russians. If you talk to them, they think that they have their own spheres of influence, including Central Asia, as outlined by Professor Satarova, or Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Caucasus, etc. Increasingly Middle East and Africa. And so even if Ukraine wins, which I hope as a Ukrainian citizen, I think this deeply rooted Russian imperialism still has to be addressed. It will take decades to be addressed. We see it with the example of Western imperialism, when it was explicitly condemned half a century ago, but we still see how slowly this imperialist mindset disappears with the Mauritius example of the advisory opinion regarding Mauritius. And in this regard, the Bandung spirit, as I broached a little bit yesterday during my comment at the plenary session, should be, as I see it, reconstructed today by expanding the list of countries that can in principle be considered imperialist. That is, not only Western imperialism can exist, but also Russian imperialism does exist and should also be addressed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Professor Sergey, on the right side, yes.
Dear colleagues, good morning. Mine will also be a comment, not a question, and I'll try to keep it brief, but I would like to make this important point. And I'm speaking now not as a pro-Ukrainian scholar, although I have been pro-Ukrainian since 2014. I'm speaking as a Central Asian scholar, and I would like all in this audience to please hear me, because this will be a warning. I fully agree with Professor Joanna's suggestion that the Bandung principles are relevant in this situation, but it is not Ukraine who must be reminded of these principles. It is Russia who must be reminded of these principles. Because Russia is indeed an imperialist country. Russia does not just want to control Ukraine. Russia wants to control all of the post-Soviet space. This is very clear. This war against Ukraine, and by the way, over these 2 days, many speakers repeatedly referred to this war as a war in Ukraine. It is not a war in Ukraine. It is Russia's war against Ukraine. So Russia's war against Ukraine was predicted as early as in the 1990s by Professor Zbigniew Brzezinski in his Grand Chessboard. It was 30 years ago that he predicted that Russia would not be able to be an empire without Ukraine, without these 40+ million people, without this cradle of Eastern Christian civilization, which gave to Russians its church, its alphabet. So Russia would not be able to be an empire without Ukraine, and so this war predicted by Brzezinski 30 years ago is very, very logical. But Russia does not want just Ukraine, it wants the Baltic states. Russian politicians repeatedly say that after Ukraine will come the Baltic states. Russia wants Central Asia, and time and again Russian politicians say that Kazakhstan, the country of which I'm not a national, but where I have been living and working for 9 years, they say that Kazakhstan got its territory from Russia as a gift. And this comes my warning part. Ladies and gentlemen, unless Russia is disabled as a result of this war, and I'm using this word disabled to say it may lose to various extents, but whatever that means, as a result of this war, it must be militarily disabled so that it is no longer able to wage other wars. Because if Ukraine loses, and if Russia is not disabled, Kazakhstan will be next. And my colleague and friend Miraz Daulenov spoke yesterday that the land border between Kazakhstan and Russia is the longest land border in the world. It's more than 6,000 kilometers. It's very difficult. It would be very difficult for Kazakhstan to defend itself. In fact, one of my friends in Kazakhstan said some time ago that Putin was stupid enough to attack Ukraine. If he had been smarter, he would have attacked Kazakhstan, where support for Russia is much greater, where the population is smaller, and where the armed forces are weaker than in Ukraine. So this is the warning part. If Ukraine loses, and if Russia is not disabled, there will be another war against Kazakhstan. And the final part will be anecdotal. But the anecdote is frightening. A few weeks ago, a friend of mine from Almaty went to Vietnam as a tourist, and there was a Russian-speaking tour guide there in Vietnam. In a chat, that tour guide said to my friend, well, there can be two consequences of this war. One, the whole world will speak Russian, or two, otherwise. I hope the first option will never materialize.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for the comments. I guess there's no direct question, so I give the panelists to make the comments as also as the closing statement, because we're running out of the time. So I reverse the sequence for the comments and also closing to first to Professor Sahabuddin. But I would like to also to make comments that we are here not to focusing on one certain case or incidents, but we have a bigger things also to consider. Professor Sahabuddin, 1 or 2 minutes.
Thank you. I mean, I'm not sure like what additional comments I can make, but overall, I hope the conference is going well. And going back to the point about Bandung and its position on imperialism, I think it has a lot to offer, but the problem then is how we engage. As I say, the Global South is not a kind of homogeneous entity or a kind of you need as part of the overall global governance structure. But the lessons that we had from the Bandung conference in the 50s are still relevant in many ways. And I think this workshop, this conference is a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect back in a self-critical way and move on with new spirit and new energy. So I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Habuddin. Professor Juwana?
Well, thank you very much. I don't think we have a scholar from Russia here, right? Because if we do have a scholar from Russia, there's going to be a contesting view. But I'm here not to say that, we need to have our views. The question is, are we going to have peace, right? Now, the Bandung Conference was instituted because we understand the issue of imperialism. Of course, from the European world at the time, they will say, look, we come to various places in Asia to civilize these people. And mind you, in Article 38 on the sources of international law, there is saying the uncivilized, civilized nations. Yeah, principles of laws recognized by civilized nations. Meaning, at that time, there's a division between civilized and uncivilized nations. And the Bandung Conference stated, no, we are equal. If you think that we are uncivilized because you use your perspective, your glasses, why don't you use our glasses in looking at, whether we are civilized or not civilized? But at the end of the day, it is peace that we want. Indonesia, for example, we are accused of annexing East Timor. But from my point of view, when I was younger, I said that, like my government statement, that East Timor is the one who wants to integrate with us. The question is annexation and integration. As lawyers, most of you are lawyers, right? You sometimes see facts from two different perspectives. You can see facts from two different perspectives. And it is natural. The question is, who's going to decide whether you are right or you are wrong? In our domestic law, we have a court. But question is, under international law, do we have an effective court like domestic court? We don't. That's why, to me, the 10 principles of Bandung spirit is very relevant, even in the current days. So we have to think about the people of the world without looking us, whether, I have to say, sorry, Ukraine or Russia or, us in Europe. We have to think all of us, because all of us will be affected. So I think that is my question, the answer to the two questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hikmahanto Juwana. Professor Mafruza?
Thank you. To me, the comments and questions raised so far, taking them outside the context of war, again, point to the important questions that were raised during the Bandung Conference, but also continue to shape the decolonization movement and the agenda. And that is, again, the sheer plurality of third world perspectives and the need to acknowledge that decolonization is not this linear movement that started post-Second World War, that it continues, and that various forms of imperial domination can take different shapes. And we need to be cognizant of that. And that we need to be cognizant of that regardless of where we're dealing with these issues of decolonization, be it international laws governing peace, security, and so on, but also international economic law, because there are so many examples of where those imperial legacies, but also imperial forms of domination are still hiding in the plain sight. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahfudan. And last, Professor Tladi.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate this opportunity for the last words because I hadn't actually managed to get through my presentation.
Okay.
So I'll just make maybe one point that I wanted to make. So I'd started off and I had described what I thought were the problems. I thought maybe I might point to one solution, which is actually in a sense linked with the question that you asked, who are we to judge? And that is one of the solutions, I think, for sort of undoing the legacies of the past, for me, is reducing the effects of auto-interpretation, reducing the effects of every state is free to determine for themselves whether or not there has been a breach of law. And one way that we can do, I mean, there are many ways that you can do that, but the critical point of reducing auto-interpretation, I think, for me, is empowering judicial solution of disputes. And I'm saying that not only because of my current situation, I'm saying that because I think as an international lawyer,
Yes,
it's extremely important that we do that. You know, and I'd hope to say a little bit more, but I'm sure we can talk in the course of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tladi. Dear colleagues and professors, I don't think I would like to make any conclusion because it's really hard for me and I'm not in the role to conclude anything. I guess all of us have our own thoughts, our own position to make this kind of thoughts, and maybe out of this discussion there will be some more discussion, some more research to do, and hopefully as a scholars we can put out our thoughts in a scholarly way, so that everyone can share their thoughts without any outpowering to each other. So we are here as a scholar to make an equal and constructive discussion. I guess that's all for me as a moderator, and I apologize for any inconvenience caused with this moderator. Thank you so much for Professor Sahabuddin, all the way from UK. Hopefully you can come here someday to Bandung or to Jakarta. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I back again to the Master of Ceremony. Billahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Chief.
If I might make an administrative announcement, we mentioned the interest groups yesterday. So a very effective way of getting involved in the work of the society is to participate in the interest groups. So Ari, I'm a bit confused about the program. How long is lunch?
1 hour.
1 hour. Okay. So at least, Emil, do you know what's happening? Good. Thank you.
Okay, so about the interest group, the meeting will be done in the panel room on the 3rd floor while during lunchtime. So for about 12 until 1, and you will be able to bring your lunch. You will take your lunch from the back to the meeting room for the IG. So we're going to meet for about 1 hour, and there will the room has been assigned for room 1. There will be the human rights interest group, convened by Professor Sergei Sayapin. The second room, room number 2, the Law of the Sea group, will be convened by Professor Tara Davenport. Room 3, History of International Law, will be convened by Professor Toyoda. The fourth room, the Environmental IG group, will be convened by Professor Mustafa, and the fifth room, the foreign investment room, will be convened by Professor Mavluda. And so you may proceed to take your lunch and maybe take it to the third floor. And the liaison officers will guide you to each room. Thank you.
And sorry, just one additional announcement. We also have an international criminal law interest group, but the conveners are not here. But if you are interested in joining that interest group, the International Criminal Law Interest Group, could you please provide your name to my colleague, Emil Valdez? Emil, which email should we use for you?
I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, we will be entering the next agenda, please, for the giving of token of appreciation. So for this session, Dean of Pisip Unjani, Dr. Agus Subagio, SIPMSI, will present to all the speakers. And then after this, we will enter the room for the lunch, and then we will entering the room for the discussion. All right, thank you very much for all participants. You may have lunch, and then you also may bring your lunch into the room if you want to, and then you can go to the every class that you are divided into in the third floor.
Record.
Hi, activities organized by these groups throughout the year.